Lisa Singh, welcome. A simple question first. Labor opposed the tax cut package in the Senate at the end of last week. Does not logic dictate that that means that given the chance, Labor would repeal these tax cuts for small, medium-sized businesses?
Well, we've made our position clear about the government's $50 billion company tax cuts right from the start, but we will wait and see what the government's AAA credit rating is like at the time of budget, but also what other cuts the government's going to make in the budget before we determine our position regarding this new package the government's put forward, which of course is still company tax cuts. What the government didn't win on last Friday was in fact its package to cut company tax cuts for some of the biggest corporations in this country, and that's something that's still on the agenda for this government and something that Labor urges the government to drop and instead focus on the terrible cuts it wants to put in place for some 700,000 workers in this country, where it wants to cut penalty rates and support Labor in our efforts to stop that from happening.
The history of these things generally is that where governments introduce tax changes, and you can go back to the GST in the late 1990s, for example, Labor railed against the introduction of the GST, but when you won government in 2007, there were no real changes made. So the indications are that if history is correct, you'll simply cop it.
Well, we need to look at exactly what went down last week in the Senate. I mean, we were left there, held to ransom, right up to almost Friday night, while the government tried to scramble a deal together with Nick Xenophon to get its company tax cuts through. And even then, it didn't get its full signature package through. This is the only dot point in the government's economic plan that it has. And so far, it has showed that it is unable to try and, effectively run government by having to do it by holding the Senate to ransom, filibustering on its own bills. And now it's, trying to sell it as some kind of win. This is no way for the government to run the country, and in fact we know very well that this package that it is put out so strongly ever since it won government, to have to try and scramble it through on a Friday afternoon in return for a few reports and sweeteners that Nick Xenophon wanted, and certainly that didn't end up being exactly what he wanted anyway. Leaves the whole country going, what is this government doing? And what it's doing, we know very clearly, is instead, not looking after the most low income in the country, continuing to want to support the big end of town, and rather than actually addressing what some 700,000 workers are worried about in this country, and that's having their penalty rates cut. And part of this package as well, of course, is some one-off payment for pensioners. Now, the government again has sold this as a win. It is cutting the energy supplement, which is $365 a year for pensioners, and replacing it with a one-off $75 payment. How is that a win for pensioners and for low-income Australians? Again, this government continues to focus on its kind of trickle-down economics approach, an approach that has been, ruled out by so many well-known economists in the world, to give big company tax cuts in the hope that this will create some kind of economic growth. Well, we will see how that all pans out for the government. But in relation to what is lying ahead of us, and of course that is the budget, Labor wants to see, sensibly, what other cuts are going to be made in this budget, what else is in this budget, but also what effect this is going to have on Australia's AAA credit rating.
Isn't it also something of a dilemma for Labor, though, because if you don't repeal or try to repeal these tax cuts, leaves you with $25 billion less to spend on the programs that you would like for the less well-off?
Well, Well, you raise a very interesting and very good point, because the fact is, at the moment, this government is doing nothing to address the deficit that continues to keep growing. We know that if they continue to go down the path of cutting penalty rates, that's going to cost some $650 million. This new one-off payment for the welfare payment deal that they've done with Nick Xenophon, some $250 million, as well as the $25 billion cost of these company tax cuts so far, and the other $25 billion that they'll cost when they do the second tranche of that package. So how is this addressing the deficit in this country? How is this economically responsible? These are all questions that Scott Morrison has failed to answer, and that's why it'll be very interesting to see what kind of budget he pulls together, because at the moment they simply don't want to answer some of these difficult questions around how they are going to address the deficit, a deficit that has continued to grow each year since 2013. Once upon a time we had a budget emergency under a previous treasurer, and now it's something they simply don't want to talk about in regards to the deficit. This package that they got through last Friday night does nothing to address that. It does nothing to address a number of factors that are worrying Australians, to do with growing inequality in this country, the effects of some of our lowest income workers, the fact that so many workers in Australia, some 700,000 or more, will, under this government, if they succeed, have less take-home pay. We've heard some harrowing stories about workers that are doing 2 jobs just to make ends meet, in the hope that they bring home more because they're getting penalty rates for some of that work. That being taken away by this government. So these are the real concerns that the government doesn't want to address, and part of that, of course, is the deficit factor.
It may be an interesting question for the government, but it's also an interesting question for Labor, because under current circumstances, with this tax cut, unless you are prepared to repeal it, you will have, or would have, less money to spend on the programs you would like to advocate. So it is a dilemma for you, is it not, as whatever it means for the government?
Well, look, we will, and already have, put forward types of economic reforms that are certainly well beyond one dot point. And unfortunately, the government went to the last election with a slogan of jobs and growth that only had one dot point assigned to it, and that was these cuts to the company tax rate in the hope that they will bring economic growth. Well, Labor has a much more comprehensive strategy and plan for this country than that, and that certainly goes to the heart of issues like housing affordability, of the underemployment in the country, of the fact that wages growth has stagnated, of looking at capital gains tax. We have a much more comprehensive package that deals with both social and economic issues facing the country, which this government doesn't have. So come the time of the election, and indeed the time of the budget, we will be showing very clearly the differences between this government and what a Labor government would put in place. One that stands for fairness, one that stands up for all Australians, in the hope that we do indeed have a turning of that divide of inequality that's still very much a highlight of this country.
Another subject, Labor opposes the signing at the moment of an extradition treaty with China. This was advocated by both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard when they were Prime Minister. Under what circumstances would Labor be prepared to support the ratification of this treaty?
Well, again, this has been another debacle by this government this week, and showed the terrible disunity that is going on inside the Turnbull government. But Labor made its position very clear during the Joint Committee on Treaties on this issue, that the government knew that Labor wanted to have a review of our extradition framework, and I think that is a very sensible way forward, so that we're not just looking at an extradition treaty with China, but we're looking at extradition treaties with a number of countries that we have in place, so that we do have the necessary safeguards in place, so that we can feel assured as to the decisions that we make about sending people back to the country they may have come from, or whatever the circumstances may be, that an extradition treaty process has necessary safeguards and transparencies in place. Now, that's been Labor's position since going through that treaty joint parliamentary process. The government knew that. But instead of actually recognising that and recognising that therefore it wouldn't get its treaty bill through the Senate, it tried to ram it through anyway and had so much disunity and dissent within its own side. Now I see that there's some kind of leaking of national security documents going on between the current Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister. I mean, this is no way for Australia to show how it handles diplomatic relations. This is really damaging Australia's reputation and embarrassing us as a country. And it just, again, is another example of this terrible disunity, dysfunction of the Turnbull government, and something that could have been completely avoided if the Turnbull government would have handled this a lot differently.
Lisa Singh, we had better leave it there. Do appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim.